Hello and welcome to another episode of Pod of the Gaps. I'm here myself, Aaron Edwards, and I have the usual suspects with me, Michael Otts and Andy Bannister. Hello guys, how you doing?
Doing well.
All right, thank you.
I haven't said what the podcast is about, have I? I should have said this is a podcast about culture and church and that kind of stuff, but really it's about whatever comes to mind, usually, isn't it? It's about Michael's baking and Andy's various habits with wood burning and things like this.
And one of these days we'll actually have a really professional introduction to this show and people won't know what's happened.
That's it, exactly. And actually, funnily enough, we probably have to get a bit more professional because we had our first donors in the last couple of weeks who've been giving us something via Patreon, which is very nice. So if anyone else wants to keep doing that, Andy will find a way to use the money appropriately, won't you? You won't be going on any terrible expenses trips to Antigua.
Well, I was thinking of redecorating a flat if we get enough money raised through Patreon. You know, I was just thinking following our beloved leader's example. Although somebody pointed out in all defence to Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, who's been in trouble for spending money redecorating a flat. The previous famous Labour Prime Minister a few back, Tony Blair, he was it wasn't that long ago. He was busy spending £90 per roll of wallpaper redecorating the same flat in 10 Downing Street. So there's a kind of history.
There you go.
But there we are.
Well, but it's a serious thing, isn't it? There are lots of things we could do to try and expand reach and things like that of the podcast, and it'd be good to sort of, maybe improve our sound quality at some point. That would be nice, wouldn't it? But you know what the proper podcasts I've noticed do. I presume we are a proper podcast, aren't we? But we're not like a professional one yet. The ones who are really serious in it, like this, like their full-time job, they tend to do these kind of levels, don't they? Like if you I don't know, you support a prayer supporter gets, a mug, someone else pays a certain amount a month, they get a kind of like t-shirt or something. I was thinking we could maybe have Michael make people a podcast pie, and just mail it out to them with like some kind of Pod of the Gaps logo on branded on the front. Would you be up for that, Michael?
Podcast pies, yes. Live not by pies.
Live not by pies,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. See, that's a ready-made pun for you right there.
Yeah.
So what have you guys been up to in the last week?
Well, I get the chance to look down on you lowly people in the south of this glorious sceptred isle, because in Scotland, where I am, cafes opened up after COVID on Monday. So I actually got to sit inside a cafe yesterday, like with four walls and a roof, and have coffee with a friend. It was quite interesting because I'd always forgotten how to behave in cafes. I was eating off the floor and feet on the table and stuff. My friend had to go, no, Andy, that's not how we do it. So it was quite surreal.
You do realise that, Andy, the reason why you're allowed to eat inside a cafe in Scotland, whereas we have to eat outside a cafe in England, is that it would actually be a greater public health hazard to try and get people to sit outside a pub all evening in the freezing cold in the north of Scotland.
Exactly.
That is probably it, actually. So COVID numbers here are really low, which is great, but hypothermia numbers are as high as ever. So that is the Scottish climate. You're quite right.
That's the shame. And Michael, have you obviously I know you've now been baking many podcast pies to send out to all of our faithful supporters, but other than that, have you been any other kind of baking exploits?
No, I've been doing my regular sourdoughs. In fact, I realised that sourdough posts on Instagram do get far more kind of take up and interest than posts about our podcast. So I was thinking maybe I just need to post each day about my sourdough and then add a little link to the podcast, the piecast as we might now call it.
That's it. It.
We've also been in the process of moving house. So at this moment in time, we are waiting for solicitors to call to exchange contracts. But I've given my wife my phone, so she can deal with small.
So in between recording this podcast, Michael is soliciting. There we are.
Excellent. Wow. Splendid. Well,
not to be retweeted.
Well, I guess we better get on to talking about something other than pies. We should talk about lies instead. And one of the things that we're going to be speaking about really especially today
so well done.
Live Not by Lies, this book by Rod Dreher, which we've mentioned in advance with some of the other discussions we've been having. Live Not by Lies, the subtitle of which is A Manual for Christian Dissidents. Manual for Christian Dissidents. And obviously, we've bought this book each and sort of been reading through it over the last few weeks. And I did make a point in our reading episode, a couple of episodes back, about how appreciative I am that evangelists like Andy and Michael take the time to read books and they don't just kind of think, oh, I know everything. So I just want to say again to both of you, thank you so much for taking the time to read the book all the way through in order to facilitate this discussion. It's called Live Not by Lies, so now would be the moment if anyone wants to declare that might not be the case.
You mean
No,
it would be terrible if we're going to talk about a book and say somebody hadn't done the reading that we talked about in preparation, right? Is that what
that would be a terrible thing. But they could pretend that they had, I guess. That's an option.
Yes. I mean, I've read the book. Have you read the book, Aaron?
I've read the book. I don't.
So if there was one person who hasn't read the book, there would only now be one. Michael, have you? How was the book?
So for our non-viewers, as I kept saying last week, I have now turned a rather shade of red. It's not sunburn. I have read a good part of the book, at least all of part 1, mostly, and some of part 2. Which is slightly awkward because we're now going to talk about it. So I was thinking, I'm really glad that this is a kind of podcast between 3 of us. So my hope was, I could kind of sit here kind of quietly and contribute when I get to the chapter that I have read, as opposed to the chapters that I haven't. My one defense is that we have been moving house, or in the process of, but that's not really a good excuse. I was thinking earlier, it's a little bit like, when you were at school and you had to kind of revise for exams, and it wasn't so bad when you did most exams because, you could just sit there quietly, kind of catching up on your sleep and not answering the questions. But when it came to the French oral exam, it was really embarrassing because in that situation, like your examiner could see immediately that you didn't know the answers, and you had to just kind of sit there rather like embarrassingly trying to make up French words that you didn't really know.
That's it, yeah. Andy, we really missed the trick, didn't we? We could have actually played all sorts of like tricks on Michael and just said like, "Oh, do you remember that? The chapter about like the kind of Loch Ness monster? It's so strange that he would go there." But I was really compelling argument. Let's see if we can get him to sort of agree. No, we of course sympathise. I had many moments as a student myself going to seminars and not having read the book. And one time I admitted it straight up at the beginning. I was like, I feel like I'm honourable because I've turned up to the seminar. Loads of people just don't turn up if they haven't read the book. And then I said, they went round to what do you want to talk about? Everyone, they go around the room. I said, well, I actually haven't read it, but I thought I'd come to contribute. As well, you're not going to be able to contribute much today, are you? I got a real death stare from the lecturer. I was like, right, okay, you're telling me not to turn up then, like everyone else who hasn't. Okay, I'll do that next time.
I think, Aaron, they were just telling you to read the book.
I think that could be it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's true. In fact, that is the appropriate way to interpret that, rather than the when one hasn't.
That's exactly it.
But anyway, we're glad you have turned up, Michael, and you have, of course, taken at least some of the book. And I think, really, as you said, this isn't so much a book review episode as something where we're going to help the book kind of to sort of use as a kind of a springboard to the kind of wider ideas that it speaks of. And one of those ideas, of course, the book is called A Manual for Christian Dissidents, especially because it's this notion of soft totalitarianism. It's kind of a key term that the first part of the book does sort of go into in a big way. So just to kind of kick off, I thought maybe you could tell us what soft totalitarianism is. Michael, you've read that bit, I think. So this will be a nice, easy one for you. So what is soft totalitarianism? Are we going crazy? Is it a conspiracy theory when we talk about that? What's your take and what was Dreher's take on it?
Yeah, so Dreher's picking up on this line by Solzhenitsyn, Live Not by Lies, and using that really and the kind of experience of people who lived through the totalitarianism, particularly of Soviet Russia and Eastern Europe, to say, well, are there similarities, are there parallels to what we're starting to see increasingly in Western society? And he says there are. Now, the difficulty is, like, when you say that, like, some people go like, we're going to be like communists by next week. And then other people just go like, don't be so stupid. Like, we're not going to be Marxist and like it's ridiculous. Like, stop kind of being a scaremonger. And he said, look, okay, situations are not exactly parallel. And what may happen in Western society in the next 20, 30 years obviously won't be an exact mirror image of what's happened before. But we'd be really unwise not to learn the lessons of history and see where there are similarities in terms of a growing totalitarianism. We talked about freedom of speech last week and this threat to freedom of speech, which is obviously tied up with that. And so, well, actually, do we need to be careful here? Like, there are real threats that we need to be aware of. And then if this is where things are heading, like how should we respond to that as Christians? What is the way that we're to live in that kind of society?
Yeah.
And obviously we'll think about that a little bit later.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Anything else to add on the back of that, Andy? This sort of sense of where totalitarianism is.
Exactly, and I think what I found so helpful about Dreher's book is it gave me a framework for some things I've been thinking about and noticing for a while. And he does make this very important, I think, distinction between hard totalitarianism, which is what we see in places like China today and other societies we've seen in the past in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and what he now calls today soft totalitarianism. But the thing that links them is the idea of a totalitarian society is one in which you have an ideology that seeks to replace all other prior traditions, replace all sort of competitors, and the idea that you bring the whole of society under control of your ideology. And in the sort of older forms of that was done using, using physical restrictions, actually sort of, basically locking up dissidents, using violence in places, whereas soft totalitarianism does it a very different way. It does it more sort of therapeutically. It does it through sort of insisting that if you disagree with the ruling ideology, you're a bad, harmful person, and then it does it largely through fear, actually making people be afraid that if you speak out, if you take a different view, you're going to end up losing a job, being no platform, having the Twitter mob come after you, and so on and so forth. And a nice little line, actually, I've got from Dreher here. He says, look, as part of its quest to define reality, a totalitarian state seeks not just to control your actions, but also your thoughts and emotions. The ideal subject of a totalitarian state is someone who has learned to love Big Brother. And that really, for me, defines the age that we're in. There's a kind of sort of woke progressivism, a number of ideologies out there in our secular culture, and increasingly I think the pressure is that you actually have to think the right way, not just do the right thing. And should we discover that you have the wrong opinion, then that can go very ill for you. As in fact, on last week's episode, we talked about our old atheist friend Richard Dawkins, who 10 years ago was an absolute hero of the secular sort of state that we live in. His book sold millions of copies. Now he tweets the wrong thing, he has the wrong opinions, and boom, no platforms, game over.
That's right. Yeah. No, thanks, Andy. Michael, how about any kind of favourite quotes from you from this sort of thing?
Yeah, this is the bit where you really test who I've actually read. I do have. I'm just for our non-viewers. I'm holding it up, and I have got underlined bits. So yeah, just little proof there. But actually, sorry.
No, sorry. I just thought you'd said for our non-viewers, and I thought you'd said for our viewers, and
No. I'm now calling our listeners. I guess that's what we should. That's a much better terminology. Actually, it's connected to what Andy was saying, because he was talking about this kind of soft totalitarianism that we learn to love Big Brother. And there is a line here. It says it's hard to get worked up over Big Brother when you've already grown accustomed to big data, closely monitoring your private life via apps, credit cards, and smart devices, which make life so much easier and more pleasurable. In Orwell's fictional dystopia, the state installed telescreens in private homes to keep track of individual lives. Today, we install smart speakers into our homes to increase our sense of well-being.
Yeah.
So in a sense, we're kind of welcoming people in. It's not being forced upon us. And it's an interesting question. I was listening to someone else speak the other day, and they were saying, when we think of totalitarianism, the number one thing we normally think of is government, the state. Yeah. But actually, is it big tech rather than the big state that is the one that's holding the power? And when you kind of get situations in society where companies are starting to wield more power than governments and are able to dodge the power of governments in different ways, dodge tax and everything else, those are interesting questions to raise, aren't they?
Yeah.
But this idea that's actually, it's not being foisted upon us, but we actually unthinkingly sometimes accept these things without thinking maybe of where they might lead.
Yeah, there was that stat, wasn't there? 70 million people in the US who have installed these sort of smart speakers, and other kind of discussions of technology that's coming out which can read your emotions based on your facial expressions, how you facially respond to what someone says. They can read effectively what your emotions are, and therefore they may interpret what you're thinking. And now, of course, there's a few leaps and bounds in there, but that has been celebrated technology lately. And as we've discussed previously with technology, the perennial danger is we can, so we will. We can do this, and so it must be a kind of good idea. And I think one of the things that Dreher does get to, I think you mentioned China, Andy. they have the social credit system.
I was going to mention just that exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Go for it.
So yeah, well, I'll tell you what's very interesting about that, particularly, Aaron. There's a wonderful in the sense that it's absolutely fascinating sort of TV drama series called Black Mirror, which we may have mentioned on this podcast before. Very dystopian TV series looking at the impact particularly technology has. And I say it's quite a dark series because I think it diagnoses the problems and offers no solutions at all. There's a very famous episode of that called Nosedive that portrays this world in which everything you do, you get voted up or voted down by people on their smartphones. If someone's nice to you in a coffee shop, if the barista smiles at you, you give them a little tick. But then, depending on where you sit in that ranking, that opens up more things. You might be able to, you might be able to get a nicer airline ticket or live in a nicer apartment. And then very quickly, the one of the main sort of characters in that story makes a couple of poor decisions at the start of the episode, and by the end has gone from really well connected to society to basically living on the streets because her social capital has gone down. I'm watching that thinking, wow, that's a bit dystopian, but thankfully not there yet. And then it was only a few weeks or so later reading about the Chinese social credit system, which is basically the same thing. So that all of your interactions in China have taken the kind of classic totalitarian model and coupled it with big data so that, if society doesn't approve of you, I've just done scare quotes actually, but that doesn't work when you're not watching the video at home, then that might restrict your right to travel. If you don't have enough social capital, you're not allowed to buy airline tickets and travel outside the country. And so the government now keep track on every social interaction. And what that's causing, and I think we're seeing the soft version of that here in the West now, is that it's causing people to police each other. And in fact, actually, it's interesting. I was reflecting on the fact totalitarian societies have often done this. I mean, look at Eastern Europe. The Stasi were famous for the number of people on the payroll. Including even pastors of churches who would report on their congregants to the state in return for, slightly easier living conditions. Yeah. And so the idea was the state got you spying on one another. China's taken it to the next level. And now here, I think, through social media and the such like, we see this. People are so afraid of what others might think and do and say that you start restricting your own behavior and your own speech. And that's quite a frightening, slippery slope in some ways.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's almost like this is something that Dreher really goes to town on, doesn't he? The kind of, what are the socio-cultural conditions that have primed us to be ready for soft totalitarianism and not even to realize it's there, because that's how we've been so sort of immersed in the system, as it were, of consumerism, of ease and slowly giving away a little bit more freedom, not really caring so much about that. Because it doesn't really affect us. It doesn't. No one's really knocking at your door. It's so unlike a totalitarian situation. It's not. And Dreher makes that clear. We're not saying that there's a comparability to Soviet totalitarianism or Nazi totalitarianism of sorts of Gestapo, but we are seeing a loss of freedoms in all sorts of everyday ways that are just convenient for us, so we don't really mind. And so one of the things the book does. He's interviewing people from former Soviet bloc countries and kind of gauging their kind of responses, some of whom have come to the West and kind of gone, whoa, I thought this was like the land of freedom. I grew up under communism. You guys seem to not care that you're losing freedom. And we don't notice because we're swimming in the water. They've lived through it, and they're saying the same attitudes are here. We know how this stuff works. We know how it goes down. And we know how virtue signaling works socially, because you have to virtue signal to whatever the ideology is. If you don't do that, you'll be in trouble. So therefore, people stay silent and they try to protect themselves. But really, there's only so long that will last anyway.
Just on that, I think a fascinating conversation I was having a couple of weeks ago with the pastor of a church from Eastern Europe here in the UK. And he was just commenting that during the last few months, quite a lot of their congregation have actually gone back home, as in back to Eastern Europe, because they're saying actually the level of control that's been exerted during the pandemic over what you can and cannot do is just so great. And actually they're really fearful of that, because they're like, we've seen that kind of level of control before. Yeah. Now, when we kind of say that in the West, people don't sound ridiculous. But it's interesting. I wasn't the one making the points. This is saying like, we're just really worried about this, and a lot of people have gone back home actually because they feel things are more free there than they are here. Not saying that there isn't a place for changing our behaviour in the midst of a global pandemic. Not saying that, but just saying actually, what level of control should the state have over their lives? What can they tell us to do, or should it be the case of advising rather than commanding?
Yeah. And as you
Well, I
said,
think that was interesting.
Oh yeah, go.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it was interesting combining both those points. Was I think what I really found fascinating when I started reading Dreher's book was the point that he wasn't a Westerner going, oh yeah, I think I could see parallels with Eastern Europe. Let's write a book about it. Was that it was former folks from the East who he was friends with who were raising the issue. I mean, one of I was just flicking through now when Michael was talking, because I knew I'd found the reference in here, and there's books full of these sort of, lovely is the wrong word, but quite very eye-opening vignettes.
Yeah.
And Dreher says on one point of the book, he says, a Soviet-born US physician told me after I agreed not to use his name that he never posts anything remotely controversial on social media because he knows that the Human Resources Department at his hospital monitors employee accounts for evidence of disloyalty to the progressive diversity and inclusion creed. And you're like, that's quite sobering when someone who's raised in the East and knows what it's like to live under that system is then, raising the flags for here. And I think it feels a bit at times like the old, analogy of the frog being boiled, that the temperature goes up slowly. You don't sort of notice it until someone comes from outside and goes, gosh, it's damn hot in here.
And it's actually the case that, that the companies and institutions that have had to fly certain flags over the last sort of decade or so, and that's kind of come really, really fast as a kind of essential, or your business is going down. They know it's good for business, and so that's why they do it. But obviously in the process of doing that, it's not like these CEOs, let's take LGBT as an example. The rainbow flag is flown, plentifully. So Sainsbury's are LGBT, pro-LGBT. You think, what does it mean for a supermarket to be pro-LGBT? What does that actually mean? Really, does it mean the kind of executive board, they just want to show their solidarity with the people group that they would say is marginalized? And of course, we're dealing with lots of kind of complex issues there, which we'll get into the specifics of it another week, I'm sure. But what does it actually mean for you to have to show that? And if you don't show
I always assumed it was because somebody in the HR, in the marketing department at Sainsbury's who wasn't particularly sort of up on things, saw LGBT and thought it was a type of sandwich. That's what I assumed was the first connection.
Like a BLT, that's right, exactly.
I'm an
LGBT,
please, on rye.
Selling Sainsbury's own rainbow cakes. But this is the issue, isn't it? That after a while, that the frog in the water, it kind of eventually, the sort of mantra kind of gets through. But so at first it's cynical kind of pragmatism from the companies, right? We better do what everyone's doing, otherwise everyone's going to call us homophobic. So let's get on board and do that. In the same way, and Dreher mentions this, in the 50s in the US, it would have been pro-patriotism. So you need to show that you're pro-America. That's good for business. So you need to kind of be really, really kind of Americana central. Now it wouldn't be, because patriotism is kind of, less fashionable, less popular. Again, something else we could talk about at another time. But so you can see the sort of pragmatism of it. But at the same time, the more you carry on doing that, the more, actually, in Solzhenitsyn's phrase, if you live by the lie, so I don't really believe this. I don't really. I've not really got a boot in this camp, as it were. I'm just going along with it. Eventually, I think you will find yourself altering and changing. So regardless of what the issue is, it's quite a dangerous thing, isn't it?
Well, it is. And it's also, I think, the other thing as well, on the way to that believing it, there's also the place where it goes from, companies say, well, we think this is good for business to plaster a rainbow, flag over everything, to now we're going to actively coerce people. And I remember talking to a friend of mine here in Dundee who worked for a kind of research institution connected to the university. And about a year or two ago, the directive came round from HR, as they went into this Pride Month came up, that every employee had to put the rainbow flag on literally on their desk. And I remember he came to me and saying, well, what do I do? Is this the line at which I just now lose my job over? Is this the line at which I have to go, no, this is ridiculous? What interesting is we talked it through. The suggestion that I came up with was, well, what about if you were to go back and say to HR, I don't actually want to put the rainbow flag up because I actually think the LGBT community are pretty strong. Actually, I think there's still one or two issues, but largely they've done remarkably well and they've got equality. What I would like to do, though, I'm very passionate about the Free Tibet issue. What I'm going to do instead is put the Free Tibet flag on my desk to show, because I think it's important that we show as a workplace we are committed to justice. And I never heard what happened in the conversation, but I think that was one approach that we we came up with. But the fact that we all laugh at that is the fact that we know probably what would have happened in that conversation, because it's not really that the company is concerned about that issue, it's just playing the game. But the fact that the coercion is used and employees are made to feel afraid that if you don't go along with a particular the particular ideology, and I think that's where it is so softly totalitarian. Once an ideology is trying to extinguish competitors, and once it's you will think this or you are out, then I don't think there's any doubt that we've crossed a line.
And it's the peer pressure, isn't it, off the back of that? I haven't done this. Oh, that means you must hate gay people, I presume. It's like, no, not at all. But you know what? Then if you don't, why wouldn't you do this? That's kind of, we're making your choices for you. Here, look, we've already made it.
I guess you'd have a similar thing, in terms of, sports people. Do they take the knee, in response to Black Lives Matter? And, I was listening to a very helpful interview with Billy Vanapola, who I thought was actually very articulate in terms of responding to why he didn't as a Christian. Not because he was, not desiring racial equality, he's from a different ethnic background, but that he just felt that he couldn't support the organisation, and he felt that to do that. But the massive flack that he got because he wouldn't kind of go along with what everyone else did, and like it's not just now like it's good if you support it, but again, last year I remember someone saying when everyone was kind of posting about it, it was Christian tweeted we hear everything you're saying, but we also hear what you're not saying. In other words, for my Christian friends who haven't actively hashtag BLM, we've noticed you, kind of thing. I found that a little bit scary in terms of like, well, hang on, do we have to now? Do we all have to kind of prove that we're on board with this by kind of joining in? And what if like actually we have questions about whether that's helpful or not?
That's really interesting. It's almost a sense of why wouldn't you go in this direction? Why wouldn't you kind of show solidarity in this sort of way? But like I was saying earlier, I think it's like technology. It's the we can, so we will. It's the same for sort of processes that people have decided are the benchmarks of sort of ethical or moral issues. So it's like so for example, because a certain supermarket goes in this direction, so right, we're going to publicly say this, it looks bad if the others don't, because there's a precedent, a bit like the kind of countries over the kind of lockdown processes in COVID, which is another thing obviously that sort of prepped the ground for ideological conformity, and neighbours kind of going, you don't agree with the advice, or you're one of those weird dissidents who doesn't agree with the advice. It's a really a dangerous thing for that to be happening, the pandemic, at the same time as all of this stuff from the kind of woke crowds of the kind of identity politics, because it just shows you again that we're almost we're walking a line, aren't we, towards a sort of more of a totalitarian future. However that manifests, I don't expect it will be a hard totalitarianism. But as Dreher is getting into in the book, it's the softness of it. It's the fact that we are inducing one another to live by lies that we don't believe.
And I think there's a couple of things going on there that's interesting, because I read Dreher some months ago, knowing the show was coming. So I was, unlike some people who didn't read it at all, I am prepared well in advance. But the book I am really kind of right now, I'm just, I think you two have both played around with a bit. So I'm just reading this wonderful, really fascinating book called Cynical Theories, by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, which is looking at some of this other sort of progressive kind of wokery kind of nonsense, particularly in universities. But they do a very helpful distinction between justice and social justice, because the problem is the kind of social justice orthodoxy, where social and justice have a capital S and a capital J. And I found this actually a very helpful definition, where they say social justice as a proper noun with a capital S and a capital J refers to a very specific doctrinal interpretation of the meaning of social justice, small s and small j, and a means of achieving it while prescribing a strict identifiable orthodoxy around that term. And they go on to say it's absolutely crucial we separate out those two things, and it's important, as Christians, better say, we think racial justice is an equality is hugely important. It's hugely important that people are not oppressed because of their sexuality. I on board with all of those things, but that doesn't also mean, therefore, I need to be coerced into signing into a whole range of other things that I don't happen to believe are true. And I think where we're really seeing that, of course, is around the transgender piece, where, who could imagine that even 10 years ago, somebody could lose their job for saying that, that trans women are not real women. To me, that would seem to be a pretty obvious statement of fact. 2 + 2 is 4. It's not 5, 10, or 15. You're into something that's objectively true. But now, if you don't believe the lie, things can go very bad for you.
Yeah. Yeah, and on the back of that, really, so we're sort of sketching out, aren't we? That's the stuff that can happen in this sort of soft totalitarian situation, which is partnering. So it's tech is involved because we're giving away freedoms, we're being observed more, social media connected, all this stuff. At the same time, we've got the social justice warriors who have a lot of power, lobbying power, making things happen, and we've got Christian institutions, the church mainly, but many institutions within Christianity, sort of not knowing how they can respond, right? So leaders not knowing what the best response is to this sort of ideological sort of torrent coming at us, and many that I would probably say have bowed the knee, metaphorically and physically, in many regards to some of these issues. Michael, any kind of thoughts on this as the sort of the first step towards it? What's the problem here?
Yeah, I think it's a very helpful thing to bear in mind, because I think there are two kind of reactions that we can fall into. One is, we hear people talking about racial equality and stuff like that, and we say, well, of course we've got to be in on this because we're Christian. Like, that's, if anyone's going to be in signing up for that kind of stuff, we've got to be as Christians. But then sometimes an unthinking and uncritical kind of acceptance of everything, say, a movement stands for. And so we don't kind of question or look into that. And that's one danger, I think, that we just, almost we kind of Christianize it. We just say, you're for this, well, we're for this as well, and we're Christians. And we kind of almost kind of follow along on people's coattails. Or we kind of make the opposite error, and that is we are kind of very visibly seen to be against these things, but we don't articulate kind of positively what we're for at the same time. And so we just sound like we're kind of scaremongers who, if we're not for that, we must be against racial equality. We must be against kind of, the rights of, LGBT or whatever. We have this kind of challenge. So I think it's a really difficult one to navigate. And I think the other reason why it's difficult to navigate is it's kind of like, it's often quite a slippery, terminology is quite slippery here, isn't it? It's not like there's a kind of like a political party that's just representing everything. So do we talk about, far left? Do we talk about woke? Do we talk about progressive? But all of these terminologies can be unhelpful. Sometimes people will react because we feel like we're wrongly labeling them. And of course, there's a spectrum, isn't there, in terms of like to what degree we kind of buy into certain ideologies. So I think there's real challenges in interacting with it because it's vague. There's a level, the other mistake sometimes Christians make is the moment we hear any kind of word that might be associated with something that's progressive or woke, we just we label it as woke, so Tim Keller gets labeled as being a woke, progressive, far left extremist because, he's concerned about justice. And it's like, so, which is crazy. So we need to be really careful, I think, how we respond.
Yeah, no, and so it's right. We've got that kind of issue, but many have noted the fact that probably the bigger direction of travel depends who you hang out with, right? If you're hanging out with people on your Twitter feed who are the capital letter memeing on the right, conspiracy theories around every corner. I think the larger picture of the mainstream would certainly be the direction is left. It's unquestionably the case that the way we're framing our responses to things are the fear of what people will think of us, the sort of fear of negative association, which is, but as Andy mentioned earlier, the guy in his workplace, these reputational dangers, threats to career, not being given a job or losing your job as a result of this, does mean that Christians are in a very serious situation already, let alone one that's coming. And it's the Christians that Dreher is speaking to in the East who know this. And so you guys need to start waking up. You need to start doing stuff about this situation. So what did you guys find in the book that was helpful in terms of positive ways? So this is, it's called A Manual for Christian Dissidents. It's like, this is a problem, wake up to the problem. Now you've woken up to the problem, you don't just call it alarmist. I mean, Dreher gets called an alarmist all the time, but in many respects, he's showing that it's not the case, really. He's not just making stuff up for the sake of it. He's saying, look, this is really happening. Now we know this is the case, or if we believe that's the case, what do we do about it as Christians? What's the best way to go about life?
Well, it's a good question. I think I want to say a couple of things, actually. One, just to flesh something in before we look at the solution. Sure. Something occurred to me that, of course, one thing I think we want to be thoughtful about is, look, all that we've diagnosed about the problem so far, we have sort of fellow travelers who are not Christian who had diagnosed a lot of this. So someone like, say, Douglas Murray, who's an atheist writer. You look at his his book, The Madness of Crowds. You might look at some of Jordan Peterson and others. There are others who don't share our Christian convictions. It is interesting to think about what we can add. And it occurred to me, the whole live not by lies thing, of course, we also know in Scripture that Satan is the father of lies and has always worked through whispering lies in. If you look right back to the garden, the way that Satan operated there with Adam and Eve, he didn't say, hey, God said don't eat that. You should disobey. You should do the opposite, because he knew that wasn't going to work. But he came in slant. And it's like, did God really say? I think it's interesting, as Christians, we of all people should know we need to be careful to listen out for those little white lies that ease you down the track to something far from God's best. And that I think there's a reason that we've got the kind of frog boiling thing going on, because I think that's often the way the enemy works. But it's also important for Christians then to stake a claim somewhere and go, no, I'm not going any further down this, because even though this individual step on its own, may not look so bad. Cumulatively, in the case of where it's going somewhere quite dark indeed. It's the first thing. And I guess the other thing I would say, and then maybe let Michael jump in on some specifics. I think my takeaway quote from the book is, as we think about the beginning of a response, so what it means to be a Christian dissident, how to be willing to stand up. Of course, dissidents in the communist era who stood up against hard totalitarianism knew there was a cost. And I think here in the West, we have forgotten what it means as Christians, that there might be a cost for our faith. And on page 185, see, look, I've read it enough. I can give references.
Look at that. That's good. That's good seminar etiquette. That's
good seminar etiquette. Dreher says, he said, look, the old totalitarianism conquered societies through fear of pain. The new one will conquer primarily through manipulating people's love of pleasure and fear of discomfort. And then he adds, he goes on, he says, we should not conflate being socially or professionally marginalized with prison camps and the executioner's bullets, the latter of which were all too real for anti-communist dissidents. But know this too: if we latter-day believers are not able and willing to be faithful in the relatively small trials we face now, there is no reason to think we will have what it takes to endure serious persecution.
I underline that too. There you go.
Just proof. And that really struck me, because it's so easy to think about, what, it doesn't matter. I'll put the rainbow flag on the desk. It doesn't matter. I'll nod along to things. I'll keep quiet. I won't speak up. If my colleague gets in trouble because they don't affirm the transgender orthodoxy, I'll say nothing. It doesn't matter. I think Dreher is right. We've got to discover a backbone. And I say we, because I'm not sitting here going, hey, I've got it sorted, or everyone else has got it wrong. It could be, the prospect of it being tough is terrifying, because we've lived for decades where it's been very, very easy to be a Christian. And I think when we start putting our flag in the sand, and we start that journey to being dissidents by going, okay, that world is over. It's going to be tough to be a Christian now, but bring it on.
It's interesting. That's a really good point, Andy. I'll just probably jump in, Michael. On the social capital thing, Christians, we talked about earlier about actual social credit. That there's the case in Chinese society. Like, you do a good thing and you have a better opportunity. If you do a bad thing socially, civically, it's going to work worse for you in your societal life. We obviously have the metaphorical social credit that we use. The church uses all the time, and so often you do get institutions, denominations, or charities or mission organizations who will decide what battle to fight based on how much credit is at stake. And sometimes obviously there's wisdom. You do have to pick your battles. You absolutely shouldn't just blast on everything you disagree with. It's kind of a bit pointless and kind of gets you into stupid kinds of trouble. But at the same time, there's a cultivating a fighting spirit is so important. That's what in the quote you read, Andy. We need to be ready to do that. We need to be ready to fight those small battles. Not just fight every battle. What I mean is just be ready to fight for when the time comes. Because a lot of things these institutions are sometimes doing, Christian ones, we'll save it for the big fight. But really, what is the big fight? Is someone going to come and have a go at the Trinity and to tell you that they disagree with the gospel? They're not going to come at that clearly. That's not how satanic kind of attacks tend to work in the kind of current era. So they're going to come at you at a different angle. They're going to come after you, after biblical authority, by attacking a small area here or a moral issue here or something, and you might go, oh, it's just a little thing, but actually it isn't. It's a gateway to loads of other things, and that's a huge problem. I'm sorry, Michael, you're going to come in.
No, there's so much we could say, but it reminded me of a quote. I think it's from Luther, and I can't remember it off by heart. So maybe you'll remember it as I go through. But basically, the point being that if I stand up for the Christian faith and defend the Christian faith, except at the one point where it's being attacked, then that's not really courage. We've got to be prepared, like you're saying, to actually stand up and say, if this is the area where in our culture Christianity is being attacked, we've got to do that. I mean, it's amazing. We had the kind of memorial of the Reformation a few years ago, 500 years of the Reformation, and we all kind of stand up and declare the truths of the 5 solas of the Reformation, which is great, but it doesn't take a great lot of courage in Britain to stand up and declare salvation by grace alone, because no one is going to have a go at you for that. They're just going to be completely confused.
I want to go to purgatory and pay off my debts. How dare you tell me I can't do that?
I want to pay for my granny to get out. It's just not going to happen. But there are things that we can say as Christians in our culture that will incur real reaction. And if we're willing to kind of not speak on the things that where everyone will be fine, but not speak on the areas where we're potentially going to get a more negative response, that's a real challenge. But the idea of being kind of faithful in the little things so that we will then be faithful in the bigger things. Reminds me, I was thinking of the story of Daniel. Daniel, in the beginning of Daniel, makes this stand, doesn't he, over not eating this food. And we're not quite sure exactly why. Commentaries kind of disagree on that. But he's obviously making this stand over what seems like a relatively small thing. But of course, later on in the book of Daniel, he then makes this stand of continuing to pray, even though he knows that his life is now going to be taken, as far as he knows, if he does. But actually, where did he learn to make those kind of courageous stands? It was making those smaller decisions first. So we like to think, don't we, as Christians, well, if we got to a kind of equivalence to kind of Soviet gulags, we would all be kind of standing there faithfully kind of continuing as Christians. But would we, if we're not willing to suffer? And I guess the other thing on that, and I think this is more of a challenge, is, in my kind of line of work, in our line of work, when we speak publicly about the Christian faith, one of the kind of comebacks is, well, if you speak about this, you may lose your platform, you'll be cancelled, therefore you won't be able to communicate the gospel. So it can be dressed up in a kind of for the sake of the gospel, let's not talk about these things. And let's keep quiet in these areas. Let's just, present this. And I can kind of see that. I can see that there is a real danger, particularly in universities, if, just talking to someone today, how explicit should we be about the Christian sexual ethic if we're asked in a kind of public context? We need to be tactful and wise. But I think if we're not willing to say anything for fear of being cancelled, I think there's a real danger there. And, people see through that as well.
Yeah. And it's just really helpful, Mark. And actually, funnily enough, critical race, we're not going into race theory now. I'm sure, again, we'll open that can of worms another day. But that's one example. Critical race theory, so many elements of it, the BLM stuff, it's directly counteracts the gospel, like the fundamentals of what evangelicals believe about forgiveness and how guilt works and things like this, and personal guilt. Lots of things we've maybe fought for within churches previously. Now that's being attacked in so many ways, but in ways maybe quite subtle to some, but it's quite obvious to others. But even then, we're not willing to defend the gospel. That's a very obvious point. But the Luther quote is fantastic. I heard that from Andrea Williams, I think, the Christian Concern charity, and they often get in trouble for being a little bit fighty. But I've come to appreciate that so much more. And now, whenever people say, "Oh, Christian Concern, they're a bit crazy," kind of go out this, well, actually, no, they're doing some amazing stuff, fighting some of these battles. So maybe they'll overstep the line sometimes, but quite often we need a little bit more of that kind of courage. Just before I let you jump in here, Andy, I just want to read a quote from one of the part 2 of the book, which is he goes into these. He's got these sort of 6 theses, as it were, or 6 ideas of how we should live. And I'll read them out briefly. There's value nothing more than truth is the first one. The second is cultivate cultural memory. That's something we need to be doing. Families are resistance cells, the importance of strong families. Religion, the bedrock of resistance, the importance of religion, and against secularism. Standing in solidarity with others is the other. And then finally, the gift of suffering. But the first of those ones, the value nothing more than truth, I found a really striking example that he gives about the idea of an example given by the Czech post-communist president Václav Havel, who spoke of living in the truth. And he said, consider the case of the greengrocer who posts a sign in his shop bearing the well-known slogan from the Communist Manifesto, "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe in it. He hangs it in his shop as a signal of his own conformity. He just wants to be left alone. His action is not meaningless, though. His Greengrocer's Act not only confirms that this is what is expected of one in a communist society, but also perpetuates the belief that this is what it means to be a good citizen. So it sends a message to the people around you. And so just to finish it, he goes on and says, but let us now imagine that one day something in our greengrocer snaps, and he stops putting up the slogans merely to ingratiate himself. He stops voting in elections he knows are a farce. He begins to say what he really thinks at political meetings. And he even finds the strength in himself to express solidarity with those whom his conscience commands him to support. In this revolt, the greengrocer steps out of living within the lie. He rejects the ritual and breaks the rules of the game. He discovers once more his suppressed identity and dignity. He gives his freedom a concrete significance. His result is an attempt to live within the truth. I just find that really, really powerful to imagine the fact that your courage in those situations, though it can be dangerous, though it can be risky, actually begets courage. Courage begets courage. You don't know when you tweet something, you think, oh, is this a little bit over the line? Someone might not even like or comment on that, but they are encouraged. They're literally encouraged by what you've said. And so there's more that can be achieved sometimes by this good Christian dissidence than by staying silent.
Just on that point, we will let Andy speak in a second, but it just reminds me as you're saying that.
I feel silenced.
Yeah. Philippians chapter 1, Paul speaks about his imprisonment, and because of his imprisonment, people have been emboldened to preach the gospel more fearlessly. Yeah. So, you would kind of think, it would be the opposite, wouldn't you? Paul's been in prison for preaching the gospel, so therefore everyone else should shut up. It's no, he's been in prison for preaching the gospel, so everyone else is well, let's go for it. And it's the opposite of what we'd expect. I was just talking to a friend who's in a very, very closed country, doing Christian student ministry, and it's saying the fear is that if you say anything Christian in any kind of public context, you will just be taken down. And so they're very, very fearful of that. And then there was a girl who, in one of her lectures, was hearing stuff espoused from the front that she disagreed with as a Christian, and so she took a stand and she's just said to the lecturer, I really disagree with that. I'm a Christian. I don't believe that. And the lecturer publicly said, if you don't, take that back, if you don't recant, then I will ensure that you don't pass your course. You will fail. You will not graduate. You must take that back now. Wow. And she stood there and she says, no, I can't, because this is true. This is what I believe. And you can fail my course, but actually truth is more important. Wow. And the amazing thing is two things happened. One, the teacher was actually so incredibly amazed by her courage that she didn't throw him off the course. He was actually able to pass and graduate. But actually that emboldened all the other Christian students who had been so fearful of saying anything. So actually that we need to do this. We need to be able to speak up in these situations. And it's far worse than anything we're facing in Britain today.
Amazing. Yeah, great. Andy, without further ado.
I've been unsilenced. No, I was thinking various things. I was thinking, obviously, one of the things we obviously try and do in this podcast is explore these issues, but also do that from a unapologetically Christian perspective. Of course, I think the other thing lying behind this that's so important to remember is that if we genuinely are following Christ, we genuinely believe the gospel is true. This isn't just about, I want my free speech rights. I want the ability to speak up without getting kind of shot down. There's nothing wrong with asking that, and especially for wishing it for others. But it's also because we believe that ultimately, these kind of progressive myths that are stalking our culture do not ultimately bring satisfaction. That they don't ultimately lies are destructive. I mean, I think communism is an interesting test case because it was this sort of sold on this myth that it's going to produce this wonderful future and everyone's going to be happy. You had all the useful idiots in the West going, "Oh yes, look at Russia, it's amazing." And of course, that turned out the whole thing was lies and nothing but lies. And I think, with every due respect, the same goes for what are being told around things like queer theory and critical race theory and those things. They do not bring happiness. They do not bring justice. They do not bring fulfillment. Only Christ can do that. And so there is that sense, Jesus talked about the truth setting you free, but they also believe the truth will set others free. And although there may be a cost to us in telling that truth, if we keep focused on why we're doing it, because we believe Jesus truly is good news and that he's the only one ultimately who can solve these bigger structural issues in society, I think that gives a different motivation, because we do not want to be, I guess, to be heard as Christians, to be saying, look, we had all this power, we've lost it. We want it back so we can talk again. That's not the gospel. But the gospel is, no, we will speak up for the poor and the oppressed and those who are spiritually in need, and we'll do it if it costs us.
And just, I think on that, I think we can be very fearful, can't we, in terms of what might come, and ultimately we don't know what exactly the future is going to look like. But I think, and I see these kind of reactions, either a naivety, of course there will never, totalitarianism won't come near us. We're Britain, we have democracy, or that, or this kind of fearful, we're going to be, next Soviet Russia, and I think whatever happens as Christians, we say, look, we have confidence in the gospel. The Christian faith grew rapidly in the first century, not in a place where there was Western style democracy. There was real persecution and suffering, and the gospel grows today in places like China and Algeria and Iran, and places where there is no kind of Western style democracy, but the gospel is growing. So whatever the future holds, yes, it may incur more suffering, it may incur more opposition. But one of the wonderful things we seem to see in Scripture is that increased persecution and challenge also seems to bring with it increased fruit. And one of the things that Dreher talks about in the book is actually the one thing that we lose is nominal Christianity. As it becomes harder to be a Christian, to stand for Christ. Actually, it deepens our Christian faith, hopefully, or it will show it up for being a sham. But where it does deepen it, it then makes it contagious, and we see it spread. So I'm kind of both, concerned, but also wonderfully encouraged, because I think, well, yes, it may get harder, but that doesn't mean that that's the end for the gospel at all. No, I think it can grow, and I'm excited for, communicating Christ in that context, even though there'll be challenges.
That's what wonderful point. I mean, that reminds me of a quote from the Dreher. I think Dreher quotes Chesterton on at some point in another book he wrote called The Benedict Option, on Christianity has died many times, but it knows the way to get out of the grave. And that's we mustn't fear. We must be aware. We must go into the future with our eyes awake, but we must also go with hope, knowing that we follow one who did come out the other end, and that's the very heart of our message of our Saviour who died, and we follow into the cross and we come out the other end with him. So thank you so much for those reflections. Well worth going through, and well worth even if Michael hasn't read the whole book, you can see it didn't even matter anyway. He could get away. We could have actually got away with it. We could have lived by the lie, but we thought maybe we would.
He wunged it. He wunged it well. If that's the past tense of wing,
he wung it well. Exactly. I hope it's been helpful and encouraged you, listeners, to live not by lies, and to think about what it means to be a Christian, maybe even to be a Christian dissident in the present and perhaps even the future, whatever that looks like for you. Until next time, myself, Aaron Edwards, Andy Bannister, Michael Otts, we will see you. We will not see you. We will hear you. We won't even hear you. We will just talk. We will talk, and you might listen. That's what it is. That's what this is.
That's the way we'll get it. Goodbye.
Goodbye.